I would like now to invite to the virtual floor of our symposium Maria Sheherazade Giudici, who is actually the editor of AA File, the founder of a research platform, Black Square. She teaches design in the diploma school here at the Architectural Association. She's also involved in the PhD program, and she's also the head of the History and Theory program at the Royal College of Art. Maria will talk, as I said just before, will talk to us about ancient Roman building techniques and the labor of construction. So, Maria, thank you for taking part in the symposium, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Sorry, I was muted. Now I muted myself. Can you all see my first slide, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thanks, Pier Vittorio. Thanks to all of you. I think it's really heartwarming to see, in fact, all these people, all these friends actually here today. And maybe my task actually is to start the day by looking at a very well-known example, and maybe the oldest example actually that we're going to be discussing today, that is actually ancient Roman architecture. So it's kind of a well-known topic, but I would like to approach it maybe from a slightly different perspective from the usual. And the title of the presentation is Hoc Opus, Hic Labor, that, as you might know, is a quote from Virgil. It's actually what Sibyl tells Aeneas. And it literally means, here's the task, here's the hard work. So in a way, now that's where you get serious somehow. But I find it interesting because actually it puts the word opus on the same level of labor, where opus really means work with a capital V. That's the emancipatory, productive, the creative aspects of work. While labor is literally labor. So that's to say mere toil, I would say. And of course, the parallel between the production with a capital W work and the actual toil that supports it, for me, it's really inspiring because it's an incentive to look at the backstage of these grand works from an engineering that we all know. And they have become famous mostly for the technology that made it possible to build these dairy vaulting systems. But I actually think that this technology is poorly understood because most literature focuses on the material itself rather than the process of construction. And actually, the material is maybe the least interesting thing because the Romans just got really lucky as they had all the ingredients to produce this precursor to modern concrete that you probably know is actually very different from contemporary concrete in that it's never handled in a liquid state, but it's actually a kind of aggregation of rubble that are called cementa together with this pozzolana mortar that keeps them together. But actually, the techniques to give shape to this concrete changed a lot through time, and they were essentially pushed, as we will see, by labor conditions. So in this half hour together, what I'd really like to put forward are just 5 conjectures on Roman architecture that I hope will offer a different way of looking at history through processes, and maybe might be even useful actually as reflections on the way that we build today. And I will also be describing a historical trajectory, so the conjectures are organized chronologically. And the first phase that I would like to discuss is the transition from Republic to the Empire, as to say the last century before the Common Era. In this phase, in fact, a political subject emerges in Rome, the wage worker, and especially the wage construction worker, tying in with what Vittorio was saying earlier about the emergence of the practice of actually having wage workers on the construction side. So my conjecture is that construction in this phase was really a form of welfare for the Roman state, because in the last century before the Common Era, Rome had established itself as a really hegemonic power in the Mediterranean. And in this age, actually, there's a flourishing of large-scale construction of infrastructure. And of course, by infrastructure, I don't mean only roads and aqueducts, but also monuments, such as big sanctuaries like this one that you're seeing here in Terracina, just south of the city of Rome. And you can see here that these late Republican monuments usually are built with this technique that is called opus incertum, as I guess you know. So it's a wall of cementa that is framed by these stones that are irregularly shaped. And of course, placing stones that are so irregular required a lot of care and craftsmanship and patience. So most of the workers on construction site were free men paid a wage. Of course, that's not to say that slave labor did not exist. It did, of course, but it was not the main driver. And the reason for that is that you can pay a wage worker just for the days that he actually works, and building is seasonal work. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to engage slaves who need to be maintained year-round on this kind of site. On the contrary, slaves were more likely to be employed in workshops and as servants, so activities that would function year-round. and that would make, of course, their engagement then economically efficient. In a way, the wage worker was cheaper, paradoxically. So, but placing these stones, however, took the work of craftsmen who were rather well paid. So, they have a conundrum because wage worker is potentially cheaper, but not that much if it's skilled, right? So it's for this reason that actually in the first century, we do see the rise of a different technique that is called the opus reticulatum, like the one that you see here, that uses stones of even size and a square section. So these stones can be produced off-site and year-round. So of course, at this point, you can also use slaves. So although they do take a little bit more work to be prepared, it's a different type of labor, it's less skilled. And of course, then the workers on construction site can be radically de-skilled because actually placing these square stones is very quick and it's very easy. In fact, it doesn't require almost any training. So in fact, at this point, the state and the most powerful landlords employed vast numbers of free wage workers, some of them without any specific skill. And the construction of monuments such as this Mausoleum of Augustus, for instance, would become a massive source of employment and wealth redistribution, especially for the lower urban classes. And such as the skilling of labor would be furthered by the introduction of the opus testaculum that uses bricks instead of stones in imperial age, as we're going to see later. And so in this transition from the opus incertum to the reticulatum, we can really read the skilling of the construction worker, but also a dramatic increase in the volume and carrying capacity of the construction industry. So essentially, the construction industry is suddenly scaled up to occupy vast numbers of unskilled, free, seasonal workers, essentially constructing a basic political consensus for the empire. So it's a kind of political machine, if you want. When the city was destroyed by a fire in 64 of the Common Era under Nero, of course, there's a massive opportunity for rebuilding. And we all know that, of course, annals have spoken very badly of Nero, painting a very dire picture of the situation after the fire. But the reality is that actually the lower classes were actually really happy about it because they were rejoicing in this kind of sudden opportunity for employment and essentially wealth redistribution again. So Nero was really hated actually by the upper classes, but not so much, in fact, by the working classes. And I would call this era, for me, the year of the invisible craftsman, because actually this large volume of quickly built architecture that Nero and also his successors left to us was only possible thanks to craftsmen who had little, very, very little to do with construction industry. These are guys that actually developed innovative techniques that were game changers for the construction industry, and that nevertheless, these techniques were developed actually outside of the construction industry. And so we tend to read the architecture of this period by looking at what is built, which is, of course, quite amazing in scale and in quality. But I actually believe that we really need to study what we can see that is actually the process. So it's very well known that after the fire, Nero appropriated this large area close to the Forum to build this kind of phantasmagorical compound, kind of landscape compound, Domus Aurea. And it's also well known that this Domus Aurea would become an incredible laboratory for experimentation with bolting. What is less well understood is that this experimentation could really only happen because of the significant advancements in the making of what we don't see, that is actually the formwork. And this happened at this stage in time, and it had mostly to do with advancement in carpentry. So in the making of the formwork. So it has to do with really a skilling of a whole generation of carpenters. And we see this not only in architecture, but also and especially in shipbuilding that reached at this moment in time, like almost like the apex of the skills in the Mediterranean in the ancient age. So we really know that actually this was like kind of a golden age for the development of sophisticated techniques in carpentry. But again, why did this happen in this moment? It could really only happen because other tools that made the job of the carpenters possible. And so a class of these skilled carpenters flourished not only during Nero's reign, but also later during the successive dynasty, the Flavian dynasty. And this advancement in carpentry, as I was saying, happened really also because of other developments that happened, again, outside of the construction industry, mostly metallurgy. So it's only in this century that Rome started to control a place that it was probably the most important place for the production of steel in Europe, Noricum, between present-day Austria and Slovenia, where steel was produced. So Rome expands its colonial reach to Noricum, and so puts his hand basically on steel production, and finally starts to produce tools that allow the production of this high-end type of carpentry, especially the production of saws that could produce this kind of long and very precise planks of wood that are then used for centering, and then they allow the production of bolts on a large scale, such as the ones we see here in the famous example, of course, of the Colosseum, or, of course, the Palatine complex that expanded actually towards the end of the first century. So you have to imagine that all of this was possible, not so much thanks to architects at all, not even thanks to masons, but actually to ironmongers, toolmakers, and carpenters. So people who very often are not even present on site. And actually, most of them are military experts. So there's really a kind of knowledge transfer that goes from the military to the construction industry. Again, we have to bear in mind what we're seeing here is the end game of a process that starts with steel extraction in colonial Austria, Slovenia. And at the same time, of course, this spatial and technological complexity was really paralleled in the simplification of the construction of the walls. So every time we have a skilling, we have a kind of parallel deskilling. And this, in this case, happens through the use of the opus testaceum, so actually of the brick facing, that substitutes the reticulatum. Initially, this technique, interestingly, was used, repurposed roof tiles. So they basically kind of cut roof tiles to measure. But by the Flavian age, brickyards actually started to produce bricks in several dimensions, only for the construction industry. Usually the most diffused were besales, so about 20 by 20 centimeters side, and bipedales, so kind of, 2 feet, 2 by 2 feet, so 60 by 60 centimeters, more or less. Usually they would be broken in half to produce this kind of facing, triangular faces for the pimenta. This made the work of the bricklayer very fast, even more standardized than the opus reticulatum we've seen earlier. So the state paid actually building contractors. So this is very important. The state actually didn't initiate works single-handedly, but they paid building contractors who got their material to build from landowners who sold the resources, basically the material presence on their estates. I want to stop here for a second because this is really kind of the crux of my argument. The kind of procurement chain and the way we should cut through the layers of Roman society. So first of all, on any big single construction site, there were several construction at any given stage, not just one. Contractors actually were quite small-scale entrepreneurs with probably some tens of workers at their disposal at this stage. They managed just sections of the site. And then, of course, you would have centralized control and would check the collaboration between teams. So essentially, we could call actually this manager maybe actually an architect, in fact, first kind of version of an architect. The contractors actually, interestingly enough, usually bought the raw material and supplied it by themselves, which also accounts for the different material quality that you can see between different sections of these large construction sites. And they usually bought it, of course, from estates around Rome to minimize actually travel time. But that's an area that is almost entirely owned by powerful Roman families, so from the aristocracy. So in this way, you see that you have the elites, so the landowners, the aristocracy that profits from construction. But then you also have the contractors. It's kind of more like, to use an anachronism, middle-class entrepreneurs actually that profit too. And then you have the further redistribution of wages down to the lower classes, in fact. And this procurement system really flourished during the reign of Trajan, so at the beginning of the 2nd century. This is really the moment in which Trajan opens up a massive expansion of the fora, really unprecedented in scale and mass, therefore employing really scores of lower class free Roman citizens. He was, of course, very beloved by the population. But of course, there is a really, really dark side to all this liquidity. And of course, the fact is that Trajan could only do this scale of construction works because he had just conquered Dacian. So he was bringing in unprecedented qualities of gold. This was really like #1 boon for the Roman Empire. The moment actually they conquered Dacia, so present-day Romania and northern Bulgaria, and they brought in really incredible amounts actually of riches and particularly rare metals. And so the welfare of the Roman population really exploded, but it was based on colonial exploitation, and particularly the colonial exploitation and spoliation of the Dacians. So you can imagine there is an incredibly dark side to the fact that actually Rome lives this kind of golden age at all the layers of the population, while there are actually people being, in fact, actually expropriated somewhere else in Eastern Europe. And Trajan did not only build monuments, though, he also engaged in the construction of infrastructures. And most notably, of course, the very famous Trajan's Market, still standing in Rome today, where a number of innovative techniques would emerge and be defined. So I don't know if I can actually annotate this now. I'm going to see, like I cannot, maybe you can annotate it. Or you might be able to see actually my laser pointer now. So you see these lighter lines here. in the brickwork are quite visible. So there are kind of, lines that stand out in brickwork. You can see them now here with the dashes. Those lines represent layers of brick which go all the way through the masonry. So the brick there is not just a facing, it really cuts through. They are positioned, as you see, at a quite regular vertical distance. And they are also strategized so that they match, in certain cases, architectural features such as the spring of the arches, as you can see actually here. Of course, this has remained somewhat as a technical puzzle for a long time, right? Why would you make a layer of full brick which is less strong and a lot more expensive than the cementa? This might have to do with the fact that the brick layer allows for a better distribution of the cementa, but it also seems quite certain that now this choice was actually motivated by labor management rather than stated need. So this even layer of bricks allowed the measuring of the amount of work performed, and also it allowed different teams to establish this kind of common baselines, which confirms that the organization of the construction site was actually quite granular. We know that it was granular because each man actually worked more or less a segment of wall that would be around actually probably 2 meters, so what you can span with your hands. And we can see actually that there are moments of adaptation. Each bricklayers actually call these moments of adaptations peaks, actually, something that you can see in this and in this instance. And from these peaks, actually, we know the length of wall that actually a single worker would be in charge of. But it's also extremely interesting for me to see how many features of this architecture are predicated on what we don't see. The possibility to produce a centering, the need to coordinate labor, and to quantify production. And of course, the colonial gold that streams in. And with Trajan's market, I already introduced the issue of this colonial expansion in the Nerva-Antonine dynasty. But I want more specifically to address the emergence of a class of entrepreneurs who marked this era as a period of incredible social mobility. I would call them the colonial entrepreneurs. And I would say that whoever engaged in architecture at this point designed the void rather than the solid space. So really the formwork, the centering, that as we have seen was 90% of the problem. And many features of Roman building absolutely cannot be understood if we don't understand the building starting from the centering. So looking at the Pons Castius, there is actually a very important pond on the, bridge on the River Tiber. We can see actually these protruding elements. You see these protruding elements here. Then Piranesi also portrays actually in the back as an axonometric view. Well, these are strategically positioned to support the wooden centering. And that's actually their sole function, as you can see here. That's, of course, Piranesi's speculation, but historians have confirmed that this was probably very likely. And a feature that you can also see here in the Pont du Gard in Nîmes, very famous actually piece of Roman infrastructure. And in fact, let's remember that many seemingly decorative elements of classical architecture, especially cornices, cornices are really not decoration. They are nothing else but supports for formwork and centering that allows then the carpenters to use less timber and be more efficient. So things that look decorative are in fact highly technical. And of course, full-on wooden centering would require significant amount of timbers. It's expensive, it's difficult to transport, it's difficult to produce, and it's difficult to lower, especially because you can imagine that when actually you drop down this amount of wood, mayhem ensue. So for instance, in this case, you have these elements that are strategized so you can cut them out when wood has settled, and then you let the centering fall and detach. And the weight and size, of course, of the centering would make this operation very difficult in some cases. So the builders really look for a balance between economy and using enough wood so that the vault won't suffer from deformation, right? So for instance, in this case, actually, based on the deformation of an existing vault, we can have a hypothesis of how much wood was actually used in the centering. And we can really see that they were trying to lighten up and really simplify the formwork. Because, of course, a lighter formwork would be cheaper, but it was also easy to demold. Especially in the case of a coffered ceiling, like the Pantheon, the removal of the centering was by far the trickiest bit of the operation, really difficult. However, by the early 2nd century, of the Common Era, builders had defined a range of other possible techniques that would help them counteract possible deformation in the cement, as well as reduce the risk of damage from the removal or premature removal of the formwork. And first and foremost, the most important technique is the use of brick ribs that you can see here in the Pantheon. And obviously, brick per se performs less well than concrete, but in the case of a large building, the curing of the material can take time, can often take weeks. And the result can be ruined by uneven curing, what is called actually the creep effect, in which parts of the mass actually shrink a little bit more than others, creating instability. So the presence of brick creeps, which on the contrary are stable, is an insurance against problems of creep and uneven performance. I'm using here the example of the Pantheon, but we can see similar examples all throughout the 2nd century. They are dense, full ribs of Nimphaeus bricks. And it should be remarked that this technique is really expensive because bricks don't really come that cheap. But again, let's remember, this is an age of colonial expansion. Cash at this point really flows like there's no tomorrow, and Rome is very rich at this point. So not all excellent Roman bricks bear a fabrication stamp, but the practice was common by Trajan's reign, would go on to decay at the end of that century, and a whopping 30% of the bricks that are extant were produced under Hadrian. So that's a clear sign of just how much money was flowing in the construction industry at that point. Unprecedented and, of course, unmatched. And, of course, the brick industry at this point was a real moneymaker that changed the social makeup of the capital of the empire for good. So let's consider the set of relationships we've analyzed. The relationship between client, the state, and has the labor force. However, there's a new player in the game. The raw material doesn't go directly from landowner to contractor. It is now transformed into brick in a third, therefore adding a further layer of wealth redistribution. The word officinatores, so the makers of brick, ran the brickyards that used the material coming from the estates of the domini, so basically the landowners. Some of these officinatores were employees of the domini, but they were a minority because most of them were small, tiny entrepreneurs that rented the brickyard and primarily material from the dominus. Many of these were freedmen, so former slaves. Some of those who were employed, we know through records, were slaves who then gained their freedom and went on to become really successful entrepreneurs. 30% of the domini were actually wealthy women, so female landowners, but also a really striking 6% of the brickyard managers were women too. And in fact, actually, two main suppliers of brick for the massive site of Hadrian's Villa in the 120s were called Domitia Lucilla and Arria Fadilla, so two women. And the bricks actually were employed also in centering as lining. At this point in time, actually starting to allow the frame to become lighter and lighter and lighter, throughout the 2nd century. And this brick skin would protect the timber from sticking to the concrete, allowing then the reuse of the formwork. This would address the scarcity of timber that became problematic in the imperial era because of deforestation, of course, so massive ecological crisis. But also the reusal of the formwork meant less carpenters and therefore the lessening of the need for skilled and very expensive labor. And of course, using less and less skilled labor was essential because especially towards the end of the 2nd century, social and economic crisis was rife in the empire. At this point, that most building enterprises in Rome were centralized under the emperor, and I mean in Rome city, the capital, not the empire, destroying this former system of small contractors to enforce a top-down approach. And this, of course, killed the social mobility I previously described. And this coincided with the rise of the managers, architects or controllers, who becomes increasingly skilled vis-a-vis the radically skilled labor force. So the process, in a way, continues and becomes worse. So in ancient Rome, I would say that the less skilled the labor force, the more complex the design actually we are going to see. Basically. We move out of an age of plenty to an age of turmoil, with a state system that really struggled to hold together an empire that has become unbearably vast. So you remember these two ladies that I actually introduced earlier, Domitia and Arria. Actually, they were both mothers of future emperors. Of course, they wouldn't know that at the time, but eventually actually both their sons, and they are not related to each other, by the way, or I mean, they are very loosely related to each other. Both the sons actually would become emperors. As you know, this is actually a non-dynastic dynasty at this point, in the sense that actually the next emperor is not the son necessarily of the previous emperor. But of course, once they do become emperors, all the brickyards were absorbed in the property of the empire. They ceased being private and they become part of the state enterprise. I'm making now actually the two most obvious and famous examples, but there are tens of other similar examples. So basically, in a century, the empire starts to absorb all these kind of small, medium-scale entrepreneurs and also landowners until a point where they control pretty much everything in terms of brick production. And they cannot hold it together because, of course, the first thing that starts to suffer from this is this kind of interclass alliance that is well identified in the brick production that I described earlier. So if we look at the types of reinforcing ribs, we've seen at the beginning where they were the ones on the right, so it's kind of very full on rib of bricks. But we see an evolution of the model which progressively uses a lot less brick. And it's a calculated attempt to use as little brick as possible because the production has dropped drastically. So you see here how the ladder rib would have saved material. You might also ask why use this expensive material if the structural advantages were not very significant, especially if the vault is small. And yet we know these ribs were used everywhere. And the answer is, again, they were organized and systematized labor and the construction site. So of course, the idea is that once you set the rib, you can have workers that are even less skilled than before, and they can come in and just fill the lattice. Essentially, constructing a pretty strong division of labor throughout the construction site at different layers. So it's not anymore a way to provide rigidity, like in the Pantheon, not at all. It's actually a way just to simplify the handling of the labor force. And there's clearly a lot of design, of planning and intelligence behind this, and it has the only goal to simplify the process of construction through putting more weight on the work of the architect, essentially. We see substantial actual advancement in design intelligence at this stage, and it becomes really very, very sophisticated, and it made very large public works possible, even in an age of turmoil and of really great economic uncertainty. So these massive baths of Caracalla represented a big effort on the state's behalf to offer leisure space, but also work to a population that was increasingly disenfranchised. It was possible only through the sophistication of the design, but also the rationalization of the process itself. And of course, this process of parallel skilling and de-skilling would go on to peak and culminate under the Tetrarchy, that is a political framework that erased Rome's supremacy to establish actually 4 capitals throughout the empire, and eventually lift Constantinople as the role of head of the whole empire. So Rome kind of loses its primacy. The political and geopolitical shift would signify the end of Roman construction industry, at least as I described it, and the rise of another type of labor that would dominate the next centuries, if not the next millennium, in Europe and the Mediterranean basin, corvée labor. That's to say forced labor, not waged, forced labor that you as a subject of a sovereign, you have to offer for free to the state. Labor then became the index of this shift in labor composition. Emperor Diocletian introduced a blanket land tax that would be applied everywhere in the empire. And this was really a shock for Roman landowners, because the region of Rome, you have to imagine, it had always been an exception in the empire. It had always been exempt from any kind of land tax. But at this point, this is a clear sign that Rome is not the center anymore. So Roman aristocracy is not the elite, and they have to pay up. And so what that means is that actually these landowners pay their taxes, and they now have to pay in kind. So what do? They basically offer building materials in most cases. So timber, lime, stone, and a little bit of brick. And there's no incentive at all for these guys at this point to do a good job. They cannot care less about actually supplying low quality material because they have to. They're not making money out of that, which means that the quality of the materials is remarkably lower than a couple of centuries before, of course. Moreover, the guilds, what were called the collegia, which is the Roman equivalent basically of medieval guilds, had never been obligatory for a construction worker. So they were very loose social forms of organization. At this point, collegia membership becomes compulsory and very often hereditary from father to son. And the collegia are forced to offer services, so corvée labor, to the emperor. So they cease to have actually this pride of being a kind of voluntary organization, and they become another form of state control over the labor. So effectively, by this point in time, the state controls everything. And I just want to show you one last example of architecture of the Tetrarchy, the Nymphaeum of Minerva Medica. It is often misunderstood as a temple, but likely it was just a reception room. It's an outstanding piece of architecture, in my opinion. It's partially still extant. It suffered from a really major collapse in the 1800s, more or less. But luckily, we have several representations of this status pre-collapse. So as you can see, the concrete degraded really badly, probably due to the fact that it was inferior quality, while the brick ribs stayed together in place longer. And the design of this octagonal dome is extremely sophisticated, in keeping with what we've just discussed. So the less money, less skilled labor, the more the designers actually got creative to compensate. So here you can see how the brick ribs were used regularly throughout the structure. And the intention, although they survived better than the concrete, was again not to stiffen, so it was not a static intention, but rather to rationalize and simplify the work on the construction site. that at this point, as I said, it was probably purvey labor, so not waged, not skilled, and so on and so forth. And the managerial role of the reeds really emerges clearly when we compare this with other domes of the imperial age, where we see that the reeds don't always point where you would imagine. So they don't always point in the direction where the load should be discharged. And in some cases, they even actually lead towards openings, which is counterintuitive. But they are really instrumentalized to regularize the shape of the dome, aid in the making and removal of the formwork, and essentially to give labor a regimented pace. So I would ultimately say they are an index of human labor rather than an index of gravity. The result is intriguing because it's made out of really poor material, but it's incredibly innovative in terms of space. And as in many other buildings of the same age, architects are not above recycling, and actually they actively engage with recycling. In this case, they use amphoras that are used to lighten the load of the wall, but also serve a much more prosaic purpose. They spare valuable material and they come at no cost. And amphoras, actually, some of them could be washed and reused, for instance, if they carried wine. But those that contained oil or oily preserved foods were just single use. So they had to be actually thrown out after being used just once. And so they were very usually actually reused in construction, especially they were used to stabilize foundation. And you probably all know that in Rome, the Testaccio Hill was a dumping ground of such testaccium or terracotta, basically leftovers. Elsewhere, and I just want to throw it out there, but it's outside the scope of this talk, builders experimented with custom-made vaulting tubes inspired by the amphors that allow construction without centering. Very good in places actually where you don't have any timber, like, for instance, the northern shore of Africa. So building practices across the Mediterranean and beyond were very diverse and innovative, and in many cases actually advanced the techniques that I showed you in surprising and really interesting ways. But the vast majority of amphora used in Rome itself, Rome city, are not purpose-made. There's kind of nothing creative about them. They're the so-called Dressel 20 and 23. These are amphora that bear oil, usually coming from Spain. And you will think this sounds like, like a ridiculous detail, but actually it's not. Dressel 20 and 23 were amphoras that exclusively were used for state purposes. Oil for the military, oil for oil redistribution actually to the population, centralized through the state. I mean in this that these are no commercial amphoras. These are all state-produced, state-managed amphoras that really, come from a 100% state enterprise. And so the state has become this kind of gigantic enterprise that seeks to recycle its own waste in the face of ecological and social collapse. But unfortunately, it's too little and too late. And ultimately, the collapse of these social alliances that have fueled the building frenzy of Hadrian's era or Trajan's era also meant the collapse of the building industry itself. And of course, once colonial resources stopped pouring in, there was no way to revitalize a practice that was ecologically and socially essentially unsustainable. And in light of this, actually, I'd like to go back and reconsider my 5 conjectures about ancient Rome. The construction industry was a form of welfare, that form followed process, the void was the project, the less skilled the labor force became, the more complex the design, that architecture was the physical manifestation of policy. And ultimately, faced with an ecological and social crisis that for me really does bear some resemblance that of the 4th century Rome, the one that we are actually going through today, the question that I would really like to raise today is whether most of these points aren't actually, at the end of the day, still very much valid today. Thank you so much. Vittorio, I think you're muted. We cannot hear you.
Sorry. Thank you, Maria, for this wonderful presentation, which really introduced us to very core issues about our, let's say, symposium. Perhaps one particular issue that to me seems to be very important is this relationship between the complexity of design and the skilling, let's say, of the labor. So, which is something that I think we can see even more recently, let's say, where complexity of design often implied a much more, let's say, much more division of labor and the skilling of builders. And I wonder whether, this seems to be one of the fundamental legacy of the construction techniques in imperial Rome.
I think that for me, this is definitely the hallmark, because the more complex, spatially and technically and technologically, the more clearly they were trying to deskill the labor force, and they were trying to deskill it also by layering the different types of jobs. So of course you would need a skilled carpenter, you would need a skilled bricklayer, but then you can start actually to use a very, very actually low skill labor. Which is obviously also somewhat of a populistic move. So it's not only about actually saving money, but it's also about actually offering this kind of form of wealth distribution that is a way of actually getting consensus essentially for the emperors. I think I also have to remark something that I didn't say, but I mean, it's very important. What I showed are all examples that come from Rome capital city, so urban Rome. When you go outside of the capital of the empire, there are different political pressures. So for instance, there's less political pressure to build this consensus. And it means that, of course, then building practices can change quite a lot. And of course, the head of the empire is always somewhat both the blueprint, but also an exception in the general panorama. But I think that actually in many ways actually it set the standard. So for instance, when this trajectory that I described actually finished in Rome, it would transfer to the other important centers of the Byzantine Empire, most notably, of course, Constantinople, where the same kind of parallel skilling and skilling went on. And of course, Hagia Sophia is an important example of that, and all the amazing actually legacy of Byzantine building happened particularly actually in Constantinople, but also in other places around the Mediterranean. They all continue basically the same kind of process of parallel skilling and skilling. And then, of course, I think if you compare it with Romanesque architecture, for instance, which is in a way almost like the conceptual enemy, I would say, of Byzantine architecture, particularly in Italy, where there's almost like a battleground between these two different ways of building. Very sophisticated Romanesque and not that sophisticated Romanesque, they also imply a different organization of the construction site. This is a lot more hierarchical in the case of the Byzantine, usually with an architect. In most cases, we know the names of Byzantine architects actually. While on the contrary, in the Romanesque construction site, I don't want to say that it was democratic, it obviously wasn't. It was a lot more horizontal and a lot more based on a conception of craft that went through all the layers actually of workers on the construction site. Yeah. And of course, yes, we can make parallels with today. With the fact that the more architects actually manage, in 3D and in 4D actually their projects with increasingly sophisticated methods, the more obviously the control of the whole thing escapes, of course, those on the construction site. I guess, of course, I'm on the side of evil, being on the side of the architect, but I guess that's the case.
Anyone else want to make a question?
I think we will probably get to a point where actually there's a discussion, maybe, because yes. I think many of the themes
we can get
maybe the same, but I thank you actually for giving me these other 3 minutes, particularly actually to address the question of diversity between the capital and the empire, because I mean, I really want to underline this question of colonialism. Obviously, the main thing to know about Rome is that it was a colonial empire, and that meant big asymmetries between different places in the empire. And I think what I really hope to see actually scholarship developing, and it is happening right now, is more attention actually to the specific cultures of other places actually outside Rome itself, which doesn't mean that Rome itself is not interesting, obviously, but it means that I think we have to complete this canvas by looking at similar practices in other places. For instance, what was the relationship between landowners who produce the raw material and builders in other places? Because I think for me, the most fascinating thing is the procurement chain, right? So someone produces the raw material, someone actually transforms it. And of course, when it works, it's a virtuous circle because everyone actually gains from that. At the price of the colonial subjects, obviously, who are actually paying for that. And, especially, being very, emotionally attached to the East of Europe myself, I think it's incredibly sad to think actually that we could have the center of Rome because Trajan actually expropriated, a sizable amount actually of Eastern Europe from their rightful, in fact, inhabitants. So, yeah. to end on a sad note.
Yeah, Vittorio, maybe if I can ask a quick question to Maria.
Yeah, very quick. Yes, thank you.
So, thank you, Maria, for this wonderful talk. To me, it reminded me very much of my readings of Michel Serres' book on the Book of Foundation of Rome, right? Where he basically conceptualizes, let's say, the strength and power of Rome as the result of two models of power: fratricide and engineering power. No, so fratricide representing, of course, the struggle between Romulus and Remus, but of course representing at an even higher level Rome's military power to conquer. And engineering instead representing Rome's power to form collective modes of life around around constructions and material, if you want, processes of power. So my very quick question is of course, we know that nowadays many times states launch vast engineering projects and infrastructural projects to sustain an industry which otherwise let's say, would leave many workers and entire sort of chains of the economy without work. So perhaps my question has to do exactly with the how do you say, cause and effect or means and end of these vast construction processes by emperors in Rome. To what extent can we interpret them almost as, rather than as necessity, resulting from necessity, even, for example, of sustaining and representing power? To what extent can we instead interpret them as a result of necessity of, let's say, enduring and continuing this vast sort of process of material
Completely. But to be honest, I mean, I don't want to be cynical, but I think that that's the case for most large-scale architecture, of course, including the medieval cathedrals, I think are the best example of that. The reality is that no one needed much of the stuff that I showed you earlier. And I mean the public architecture that I showed. So things like the Pantheon or the Baths of Caracalla, for instance, that was definitely not a need from the point of view of everyday life, but it was a social need, of course. Exactly what you're saying. It was a political need. It was a political need to somehow give a banking space to all the wealth that was, of course, streaming in, and to this mass of over 1 million people that were essentially unemployed and unemployable because they were, most of them, actually unskilled. So the fact of the skilling, I also don't want to be too cynical about it. The reality is that most of these people didn't have any skills to start with. So I think you're totally right. There was definitely an agenda behind it. That was mostly a political agenda. And you said something else that I think is very important, because I touched on that in passing, but I think it's good that you actually, repeat that. There is a question of the fratricide or of war. Most of these techniques were born first as military techniques. We wouldn't have any steel tools if we hadn't had actually swords. So the swords actually were developed before saws were developed. We wouldn't have any, carpentry technique if actually ship making hadn't reached a certain level. And we might, I like to think about shipbuilding as something that has to do with trade, with exploration, with travel, but actually it didn't. It had to do all with the military and pretty much nothing else. So I think it's totally right. It's engineering and it's fratricide. It's war, and technologies are always, developed first on the terrain of war, and then they are then transplanted on something else. We all know the most banal thing of all that is, of course, that Vitruvius himself was actually a military engineer, much more than an architect. And so I think it's very good that you remark actually this question of the military. And I think it would be really amazing to see someone making research today on the interaction between military and architecture. For instance, I know that the Apple, for instance, has worked obviously with the American military, and I think it would be really interesting to know if there's been any kind of transfer of knowledge in the making of the Apple campus. I think there probably has been at some level. So I think that the point that you made about fratricide and engineering is crucial. And of course, the whole thing of engineering, as you said, it's totally instrumentalized for political purposes, because there was no pragmatic reason to do any of those things. But there was a reason, of course, to keep together cohesively a mass of people that by that time, I don't want to get moralistic because I'm really not, but I think by the 2nd century, Romans didn't share anything culturally or, in terms of actually values. So the only thing that kept them together throughout the 2nd century was money. And I know, it's a very cynical point of view, but they didn't have any kind of specific, political value or belief that actually held them together. not even belief in expansion, because by that time, actually, they were already actually at their maximum growth. They were, of course, menaced culturally by the spread of Christianity. So they were vulnerable somehow. And I think then spreading money like there was no tomorrow was the only way actually to keep them, for a little while at least, for about a century, somehow culturally cohesive. So I think you gave a really, really good cross-section of the situation, better than me, actually. So thank you.